Hi, I'm Roberta Chevret, and I'm your professor for critical methods and communication. And in this brief lecture, we'll be talking about making and supporting arguments. This is from your Composing Research Communicating Results CRCR book, and this will be useful for CRCR Exercise 4. I hope it will also be useful beyond that in terms of thinking in important ways about the arguments that we make. So, what Lindemann tells us in the CRCR book is that every paper is an argument. And this is also true for other forms of communication. Every email is an argument, every text is an argument, but a paper is a particular kind of argument. And what it is a set of statements constructed to work together that attempt to convince your readers to accept your ideas, the things that you are presenting, as ideas that are plausible, like, oh, I hadn't considered that before. They are interesting, so they are worth thinking about, and they're reasonable. And in some ways, this definition of argument that a paper is, a set of statements that work together, this does tie to the clarity of your organization and presentation of ideas in your paper. But Lindemann's also talking about something a little bit beyond that. So, hopefully, the book and the exercises will give us the tools to make our writing and our arguments clearer. But hopefully, it'll also prod us to think a little bit about rhetoric in general and the ideas of others that we come into contact with, and how best to support and explain our ideas in ways that make other people want to consider them. So, what Lindemann says is that this goes back to a question asked in the book: is your research paper fact or opinion? And Lindemann says it's both. Lindemann says it's a kind of opinion, especially for rhetorical research, because you have selected the texts that are of interest and you are making an argument about them. And that is going to be impacted by your own judgment of the artifact as the critic. However, it's not going to be solely opinion based, because in a rhetorical research paper, the whatever opinion, whatever inference or intuition or idea that you initially have about an artifact and how it works, you are going to be researching other academic literatures and conversations related to similar artifacts that are going to deepen your thinking, and you're going to be systematically analyzing the artifact you have selected. And so then your paper turns out to be not just an opinion, but an argument. So going back to this claim, an argument is a kind of opinion, but not every opinion is an argument. I have linked here to a suggested reading by Professor Patrick Stokes from Deakin University. This is just a short blog post from October 2012, but it isn't really about current events. So I think it still remains relevant. And I'm not sure from the way I've done the slide share here if you can see the article that I just pulled up, but you'll be able to find that link in the slides if you download them. So essentially, what Professor Stokes argues here is that he says each year when his students come into his philosophy class, he's a philosopher, he says, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, everyone is entitled to their opinion. And perhaps you've said it yourself, or you've agreed with it, or you've ended an argument by saying, well, I'm entitled to my opinion. And he says, as soon as you enter this room, that's not true anymore. You're not entitled to your opinion. Now, I imagine that might kind of annoy some students hearing that. But his point, he says, you're only entitled to what you can argue for. And What he means by this is that when we say, or the problem with sort of thinking, this idea of, well, we're all entitled to our opinions, is that this kind of idea is often used to shelter beliefs that should have been abandoned or ideas that need further investigation. And it can be used to create these kind of false equivalencies, like, well, because I think this or because this is my opinion, it must be true. And that's just not always the case. And one of the distinctions that he makes in the article is that there are different kinds of opinions. And the first kind of opinion that people sometimes equate with the second kind of opinion is has to do with taste or preference. So when I talk about my favorite musician, that's going to be a kind of opinion. And it's probably also going to relate some to identification, which we've discussed in relation to cluster criticism. When I talk about my favorite food, sushi, that's an opinion. Nachos, also an opinion. Although, who doesn't like nachos? Maybe people who want to eat something healthier, I suppose. So he says, I can have the opinion that vanilla ice cream is better, and you can have the opinion that chocolate ice cream is better. And those are subjective, and it wouldn't really make sense for me to say, well, no, you're wrong. I mean, people do sometimes have arguments over these kinds of subjective opinions, but that's the first kind of opinion. The second kind of opinion, he says, and his concern is that we also have views about questions that concern everybody that aren't individual taste or preference. And this ranges from politics to faith to science to legal opinions. And while we do have opinions about these matters, it isn't quite fair to say that those are as insignificant or reducible as vanilla and chocolate ice cream. That essentially, when we have an opinion about something that has a lot of research devoted to it, that we need to do our job and make sure our opinion is supported by facts. And if it isn't, then it's time for us to reconsider that opinion. So that's essentially the point here of this fun little reading. Whoops, we've gone the wrong way. So every argument needs support to move out of that realm of subjective opinion into the kind of opinion that is worth considering seriously. So, when we talk about an argument being sound, we're talking about the logical reasoning of the argument making sense. And that means that the claims support one another. So, again, I mentioned a few moments ago that some of this has to do with organization and clarity of our writing. So, one of the ways that we can arrive at a well supported argument where the claims flow from one to the next and they work together to support an overall argument is through using some tools like outlining and creating clear topic sentences, creating a clear thesis for the overall research paper, and then making sure that our topic sentences are supported by the information that follows them, and that they all serve as support for our thesis or overall argument. So that's kind of the bones of the essay. And this is true in any paper or style of paper, and would also be true in any writing that you might do as part of a career, even if it's not a career in research, that you're going to need to connect the dots for the reader. So your CRCR exercise 4 relates to several types of claims that were discussed in this chapter and which may be familiar from COM 2200, depending how long ago you recall taking that class. But those are claims of fact. Is something true or is it not true? Claims of value. Is something good or is something bad? Or claims of policy. These are claims about actions that should be taken. So, the different types of claims, regardless of which we make, or sometimes we might be making a combination of claims, but it's good to think about the type of claim you're making to help clarify your ideas and then to find evidence to support that claim. All right, so that is the end of our brief discussion of making arguments and supporting them, and I hope you found it interesting.